Hello and welcome everybody to this Partners in Care webinar looking at issues for and solutions for autistic women who live in our communities. This tells you a little bit about Partners in Care and Health. We're a partnership between ADAS and the Local Government Association. This particular piece of work has been funded by NHS England. That's about developing sector-led improvement approaches across health and social care to minimise reliance on inpatient mental health care for people with a learning disability and autistic people. This is the agenda. Now, I have the great pleasure of introducing our first two presenters. So Molly and Kay from Neurodiverse Connection are going to take you through some of their insights, evidence and emerging research in this area. So over to you, Molly and Kay, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm starting off the presentation. My name is Kay Louise Aldred and I'm a lived experience development lead at Neurodiverse Connection. And I'm co-presenting this first presentation with Molly Anderton, who I will leave to introduce themselves halfway through. So as lived experience development lead, as all members of Neurodiverse Connection, I am neurodivergent myself. I was late diagnosed autistic at the age of 48 after my 3 children in their 6th form years were diagnosed autistic ADHD. When I was diagnosed autistic, they also said that I had the ever-emerging kind of co-occurring presentation of ADHD, but I've decided with waiting lists, I'm not going to pursue that at the age I am. My professional background is teaching. I was a curriculum and pastoral leader in secondary education, leading a lot of the SEN and also mental health initiatives within secondary education. I left that profession after 20 years because of a huge burnout, and that is certainly some of the patterning we see commonly happening with autistic women and girls in the community and in professional forums. I'll speak a little bit more to that as we go through the presentation. So in addition to what I said at the beginning, the aims of the session that Molly and I are presenting is to cover quite a wide range of aspects in relation to autistic women and girls in the community. I'm not going to read them all through, but I'm presenting down to 6, and then Molly will pick up from 7 onwards. So as Kirsty said at the beginning, it's ever emerging, the language around inclusion and autism and ADHD and neurodivergence. And going to the final part of this slide, yes, we do use identity first language within the autistic community. So we would say, I am autistic. We are autistic people rather than we are people with autism. And whilst identity first language is preferred within the autistic community, one size does not fit all. And so we caution that even though identity first language is important, not everybody prefers that. So whilst that is the common ground around language, it's good to ask people individually. We also acknowledge that marginalisation and the challenges that we speak of here in relation to autistic women and girls also affect other marginalised individuals, trans and non-binary. And of course, trans and non-binary people also experience pregnancy, menstruation and menopause. So, I don't think we can talk about autistic girls and women in the community without looking at the gender bias that exists around neurodivergence. And the gender bias in diagnosis and diagnostic criteria still persists. So, up until, well, certainly when I was training to be a teacher, so, not that long ago, within my lifetime, I didn't know any autistic girls when I was training to be a teacher. And I would say that really the first autistic girls within my professional career were first being identified probably about 8 or 10 years ago. the gender bias still persists. The stereotype and the trope still persists that of a white young boy collecting and lining up traditional cars, trains, and so on, who is either exceptionally poorly behaved or is a complete genius, a savant. You know, those gender biases are still persisting. However, we are seeing a widening in diagnostic criteria. And certainly when I received my diagnosis a year last November, they said, well, the spectrum concept of autism is completely gone. And this is really important for us to consider with regards to women and girls. And we now look at the diagnostic criteria as a profile. And a lot of people have spiky profiles. They may have exceptionally advanced skills in one area, but more support needs in others. So from my own lived experience, you know, I've got exceptionally high skills verbally and with regards to language, but kind of sequencing or packing for holiday, I cannot do that without someone there supporting me. So we're moving away from the spectrum concept into spiky profiles and realizing that the traditional diagnosis does not always, often does not fit the diagnosis of women and girls with autism and ADHD. So let's just unpack any myths once and for all, where we are in the research and lived experience understanding of autism. We know that it is a sensory and social processing difference. At Neurodiverse Connection, we reject the medical model and we move to the social model of disability, and that it is the structures of society that disable and not the difference. So there are differences, not deficit, in sensory and social processing. It is a neurotype that is divergent to the current norm, whatever the norm actually is. We acknowledge it is simply a divergence of neurotype. And crucially, the presentation cannot be categorized and stereotyped from person to person. It varies. So Molly and I have completely different presentations of autism, we'll probably see that in how we present. It's a lifelong difference, and crucially, it impacts how we make sense and interact and understand and experience the world. And certainly from my lived experience, living as a neurodivergent individual in a neurotypically constructed norm in and of itself is very traumatic, and that difference, just the difference in the missing that neurodivergent people are missing within the construction of society disables you know, me as an individual in and of myself. This is from the Autistic Girls Network, amazing kind of resource if you're interested in looking at some statistics and research that's been done around the kind of numbers of diagnosis. Official statistics still say 1 in 100 people in the UK are autistic. It's higher in Northern Ireland. And we still have this gender difference in diagnostic and age of diagnostic, and girls are still being diagnosed later. And we think that's something to do with that girls don't fit the traditional diagnostic criteria, as I've already said, but also it's to do with the camouflaging and the masking, which happens earlier for girls. And yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit more about that. But you know, it's becoming better recognised. There's better kind of press and coverage around neurodivergence. People are often seeking diagnosis later in life, particularly women and girls. But there's still a difference because we think girls are camouflaging earlier, and so they're being missed or misdiagnosed. So this is from the NHS website, and 2022 is the kind of most up-to-date data I could find in advance of this. But we can see here that there's a big difference in numbers of women and girls being diagnosed, and also, you know, it isn't until we get to that 55, that late diagnosis age range, where we see more of an even spread of diagnosis across gender. So, there is, I just want to highlight the effect of the myths on known numbers of individuals being diagnosed. So I really want to focus here in on masking, camouflaging it's sometimes called, and what that can actually look like with women and girls that you may be coming in contact with in your services, and which is causing misdiagnosis or late diagnosis or missed diagnosis as well. So masking in autism can look like these things. Forcing eye contact during conversations. Certainly from my lived experience, I thought I was really good at eye contact until I actually started to really sense into what my preferred way of communicating was. And it isn't to do that forced eye contact during conversations, but I was doing it. So I came across really good at making eye contact, but that was actually a mask so that you didn't see me looking away, looking to the side, that you would perhaps see traditionally in someone who wasn't masking themselves being autistic. It can also look like suppressing stimming behaviours, regulatory movements or actions that support regulation. And we often see that girls are stiller. They might not bang or flap as much as we see in boys. And so that's masking and suppressing, stopping stimming is a way of camouflaging autism. Copying. Girls and women tend to be incredibly good at mimicking facial expressions, but also tone, pitch, intonation, phraseology. As a teacher in secondary education, the autistic girls tended to try and fit in through copying their peers, but the difference still is pronounced. And although I'm not talking in this presentation around the susceptibility or the increased bullying that happens with girls in autistic girls in secondary school, that often comes that even that forced matching of facial expressions or behaviours, their peers see through it often, even though the adults might not, the peers do. But certainly masking is that deliberate copying. Hiding special interests, so there may be a preference to one thing, but they pretend to like others in order to not seem to be different. And that one, the kind of infographic of being overly aware of the impression they make on others, oh my word, if you could be inside an autistic girl or woman's mind, that constant deconstruction of how am I coming across? Am I too much? Am I speaking too fast? Am I too quiet? Do they see me? Have they seen me suppress that stim? And also rehearsing phrases. I mean, we say repeating phrases, we've heard others, but rehearsing phone calls, rehearsing even conversations with their best friends, preparing scripts. These are all masking what would be a normal kind of natural way of interaction, so that they appear non-autistic. And researching rules and events, if you get invited, like knowing exactly what the dress code is or what's expected, but doing it in a very covert way, rather than saying, I don't understand what you're going to want from me here. They will often mask that and ask in a very roundabout, clever way. But all of this, understandably, is exhausting and leads to that burnout piece that we often see in women and girls. And we often see within women and girls, a masked girl can be thriving at school, and then they fall off the cliff edge and go into what is perceived often as a mental health crisis, but is acute burnout from years and years of chronic masking. So on top of that social processing difference and the masking that goes along with it that I talked about in the prior slide, autism is also a sensory processing difference. And the sensory processing presentation of autistic women and girls can fall into two categories. However, again, we tend to be a combination of both of these. It's unusual that someone is entirely hypersensitive or hypersensory in their sensory processing difference. They may be hyper in some areas and hyposensory or sensitivity in other areas. Hypersensory difference is where processing is big and enhanced. And this is my personal predominant profile. And you know, I can only say everything is big and bold and amplified. So, you know, smells, it's a perfect example. I've had to work a lot of trauma of, you know, being on duty in the dinner hall and like suppressing gagging at smells, or going to a social event and being given food and not wanting to bring out a packet of safe foods I've got with me, but trying to eat what I've been given. And that gag response for me is a highly refined and has meant that it's taken me a long time to actually own that and say, no, I'm bringing my own food, or no, I'm not going to eat with everybody else in the cafeteria. Big enhanced, amplified sensitivity to smells, sounds, visions, touch, and so on. Hypersensory, however, it means that these sensors are more offline, they're smaller, and they're dulled. So my proprioceptive sensory ability is actually hypo. I bump into things, I drop things all the time. I have a weakened and small and offline proprioceptive sensitivity. So I'm a mixture of both, and that's very common of all neurodivergent people across gender. But it's really important to take that into consideration when we're working with autistic girls and women in all different community settings. And being in a highly sensory arousal environment can be incredibly traumatic if your predominant profile as a neurodivergent person is hypersensitivity. And as an educationalist, schools are not good places for people who have a hypersensitivity. Social processing differences, if I was just to come back to that, to summarize it, really encompasses three aspects. We will have differences in how we interact with others, how we initiate or respond to others, and how we receive and give communication messages. And so in terms of initiating interactions, for example, it can be incredibly difficult for an autistic person to initiate a conversation on the telephone, because they rely, and girls often rely on the social cues and the mimicking of what they see happening in a person in their embodiment in order to make up for the social differences in processing information. And so they're the kind of key aspects of it. But whatever the difference is, whether it's sensory and social processing difference, these differences hugely impact distress levels, nervous system arousal, and the ability to interact, engage with work, or therapeutic compliance if we're in a therapeutic setting. So we can't talk about supporting the support needs of women and girls in the community, autistic women and girls, without talking about regulation and dysregulation. This is the most work that I do with NDC is around nervous system education and understanding how neurodivergence intersects with nervous system arousal. So why do I talk about this? Well, having a well-regulated autonomic nervous system that flows well is crucial for well-being. But within the context of the community, in mental health services or education or community-based activity, it's essential. Nervous system regulation is essential for impulse control, therefore reducing any risk. It's essential for thought, emotional or sensation tolerance, and therapeutic compliance and engagement. And so there's no interactions, there's no community well-being of women and girls without nervous system regulation and understanding body-first approaches. So all of this education is based within Dr. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. And if we look at the human nervous system and relate this to autistic women and girls, ideally, we want community settings to support autistic women and girls to be in the social engagement portion, the parasympathetic ventral vagal portion of the nervous system. That is the green zone of this diagram. In this part of the nervous system, also known as rest and digest, we are curious and compassionate and grounded and calm and settled and are able to connect in whatever way connection works for us. In that zone, we feel safe. We feel safe enough to eat. We feel safe enough to learn. We feel safe enough to interact. What happens is that if there is a really stimulating sensory environment, or a huge amount of information coming at us, or communication that we cannot process quickly, we go into the apricot zone, the sympathetic nervous system. The arousal level activates and we go into fight, flight. Here, we move from frustration through to rage or worry and concern to panic. And we are in this zone, fighting and flighting to get ourselves back into a neuroceptive, that means a felt sense of safety. If we cannot escape our environments, so the school bells or the big amount of information that's coming at us, or the loud noises, or the scratchy uniforms, whatever it is, then we start to go into the threshold of overwhelm, into the orange zone at the top. And that threshold is where the fawning and the masking response happens. It happens on that threshold line. And so the fact that we are seeing girls fawn and camouflage and mask so early on in their lives shows that we have young people with nervous systems that are in overwhelm and moving on to the freeze response really young. We are dealing with young people that are moving into freeze, where their nervous system feels there is a threat to their lives, and they're moving into collapse and immobility and shut down very early on. And fawn, it's an ever-going research topic, but fawn is it's like a functional freeze. It's a way of trying to survive. It's a survival mechanism. And in the freeze response, we flop. We become that like numb and collapsed and feel hopeless. And it's a difficult state, but it's really important to realize, if we're working with autistic girls and women, that although we can go from the green zone to the orange zone to freeze, missing out a lot of fight flight, we have to deactivate to come back to safety and connection. And so we're going to see big emotions, and I'm going to use in here the term that goes around meltdowns, big expressions, big flapping, big stimming, in order for that autistic person to come back into safety. And so I'm depathologizing here, hopefully, those presentations of meltdown, shutdown, stimming, and why it's so important. We need to let these things happen for community engagement to happen for the autistic people that we work with. So regulation is being able to tolerate the stress, the sensory stimulus, and process it and digest it and complete it without moving beyond capacity in our window of tolerance, without moving into sympathetic activation or freeze response. So a little bit more about the window of tolerance. Our window of tolerance is where we can have a really comfortable movement through life. It's where we are able to function, and neurodivergence and trauma impacts on the size of someone's window of tolerance, and it shrinks when the sensory or social processing environment becomes too demanding. So we're more likely to go into hyper or hypoarousal, fight, flight, fawn, freeze, if we have a lot of demand, sensory or social processing demands on us. So just bringing this all together before I pass on to Molly, sensory and social processing impacts on regulation. That's kind of a summary of what I've been saying. The speed information is given to us can impact on regulation, sensory environment, the expectation of neurotypical dominance around the kind of social etiquette, and we need to grow and come at our support of autistic girls and women from a body-first approach of understanding that their nervous systems are under a lot of stress. And that is just a nod that dysregulation occurs when emotions can't be contained, and there's an increased likelihood of shutdown or meltdown in these in dysregulation. And so I'm going to sign off with the understanding of the meltdown and the shutdown presentations. Meltdown happens in fight-flight portion of the nervous system. This is good because autistic girls and women are in I can. They are fighting and flighting to get themselves back into regulation and connection. Shutdown happens, or collapse happens, in the freeze response, and it's an I can't, and it's an immobilization. And at that point, the autistic person is not able to connect in any way. It's a perfectly natural response to sensory or social overwhelm and too much for them to process. So that's all I am going to share, and I'm going to pass over to Molly for the second part of the presentation. Thank you.
So I'm now going to move on and talk a little bit more about the ways in which dysregulation may present in autistic women and girls. There is a content warning for this section of the presentation for conversation around self-harm, disordered eating, and eating disorders, but there will be a little slide header before each section, so if you want to dip out at any point, that's fine. When an autistic person is feeling overwhelmed, anxious, or dysregulated, there's many different strategies or behaviours that they may use to try and regulate. The aim of regulation is to soothe the nervous system and enable a person to return to that window of tolerance by either increasing or decreasing our sensory input and arousal. The techniques that someone uses will depend on whether they're trying to increase or decrease sensory input. And this is going to depend on whether they're hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. But it's also going to differ from person to person and include things like the reasons for dysregulation. The triggers may have been sensory overload or an emotionally overwhelming situation, and also depend on their level of overwhelm. It's worth noting here that repetitive behaviours, which we often refer to as stimming, can act to either increase or decrease sensory input arousal, and this is often a subconscious process. An example of this may be that someone who's jumping and spinning in an attempt to increase their sensory input, this may be helpful for an autistic person who is hypo-aroused, but it could also act to block out surrounding sensory input and be helpful in cases of sensory overload or hyperarousal, which may have been triggered by very bright lights or lots of background noise. The stimming in this case can actually act to block out that background noise and those lights and can help a person to regulate and decrease their arousal. We know that autistic women are more likely to mask than men, and this can also include suppressing stimming behaviors, in order to try and appear neurotypical and try and fit in, as Kay spoke about. This might mean that stimming behaviors that we use as autistic women are more subtle and behaviors which are actually viewed to be socially acceptable. Therefore, we may not even recognize that the stimming behaviors we use, such as twirling our hair, playing with items of jewelry, or using a stress toy, is actually a form of stimming and is helping us to self-soothe and return to a more regulated state. I'm just quickly going to talk through some examples of how an autistic person may try to regulate. And this also includes ways that you could support them within your work to try and regulate and return to their window of tolerance. So ways to decrease sensory input may include avoiding overstimulating environments. An individual who's dysregulated because of sensory overwhelm may try to remove themselves from a loud and busy room to a safer feeling space with less sensory input. It may be lit with natural lighting, it may be soothing coloured lights, or some people may prefer it to be as dark as possible. Using noise cancelling headphones is a really good way of reducing auditory input. However, you can also decrease arousal by listening to calming music or songs which are preferred and familiar. Listening to specific songs or artists is another form of stimming, which is perhaps more subtle than the kind of movement stimming we tend to first think of, and often the stimming that autistic boys will use. So for me personally, sitting in my car and blasting some Taylor Swift songs can actually be more calming and successful in decreasing my arousal than sitting in complete silence. Again, this is because the use of stimming behaviors can help us as autistic people to reduce the arousal and to block out any overwhelming surroundings. On the other hand, if someone's in more of a dissociated state and is in need of increased sensory input, they may actually seek out sensory experiences. This could include more active repetitive behaviors. It could be using sensory items which are spiky, or eating a food which is very sour, crunchy, or cold. Deep pressure, like tight hugs or using a weighted blanket, can also be really useful. In some cases of dysregulation, an individual may turn to self-harm in an attempt to increase their sensory input. So we're going to move on to self-harm now, and just a quick reminder that if you need to step away, that's fine. And I think one of the most shocking statistics to me was to find out that as many as 50% of autistic individuals have engaged in self-harm at least once. And we're going to talk a little bit about why now. There are many different reasons why someone might self-harm, and that includes autistic people too. I want to reiterate that this isn't an exhaustive list as to reasons as why someone may self-harm. And it's really important to note that every person who self-harms will have their own different triggers and reasons as to why. Just because someone who self-harms is autistic doesn't mean that they're doing it as part of a repetitive behaviour, but this can be one reason for it. Just as hand movements, rocking, or listening to certain sounds can be repetitive behaviours, so can self-harm. If someone's feeling incredibly overwhelmed and unable to cope, or if they're experiencing either meltdown or shutdown, they may try to regulate emotions by repeating a behaviour which is physically harmful to themselves. This may include hair pulling or head banging, but any form of self-harm can be used as a repetitive behaviour in this way. A person who's experiencing shutdown may feel frozen in place and unable to meet their need for increased arousal in order to regulate with some of the healthier methods that we've just mentioned. They may, however, feel as though self-harm is an immediate solution as it provides instant sensory input in the form of physical pain. There are also a range of other triggers and experiences which may lead to an autistic person self-harming. Autistic women are more likely to internalise their distress as opposed to males who often externalise it and may display behaviours that challenge or distressed behaviours. Combining this with alexithymia, which is difficulty in understanding and communicating emotions, it can be really difficult for us to understand and then communicate our distress with others. And as a result, many autistic women will have poor self-esteem, perhaps as a result of blaming themselves for traumatic situations they've faced. And then in turn, they will have increased feelings of isolation, depression, anxiety, and helplessness. Feeling unable to verbalize how you're feeling or connect with others and ask for help in times of need may lead to self-harming behaviors as a result of seeking a physical outlet for emotional distress. Some individuals express that self-harm is a physical representation of the psychological pain they're experiencing, but that they can't get rid of because they can't communicate it. In other cases, self-harm is actually a form of communication that an individual isn't okay and that they have unmet needs. Many people are likely to view self-harm in this context as attention-seeking, and this further reinforces the negative stigma that we have associated with self-harm. Often the communication of this distress is solely for the individual themselves, just to represent to themselves that they are not okay in a way that they can physically see instead of just feel. However, when self-harm is used as a form of communication with others, it's crucial that an individual is not made to feel judged or ashamed, or made to believe that they're attention-seeking. As for autistic women especially, this may be the only form of communication that we're able to use in order to share our distress. We also know that autistic women are at very high risk of developing disordered eating and eating disorders. So 70% of autistic children are known to have atypical eating behaviours. A lot of the current research focuses on atypical eating behaviours in children. However, we know that it also very much impacts autistic adults and autistic women in particular. Whilst many autistic people display what could be called disordered eating behaviours, this doesn't mean that we all have eating disorders. Atypical behaviours of autistic people usually include a preference for specific types of foods known as safe foods. Safe foods are safe because they provide a person with an identical sensory experience each time they eat it. And for this reason, they tend to be processed foods such as crackers or cereals, as unlike an apple, which may have a different texture, taste, and look each time you eat one, they will always be the same. In some cases, individuals will need to have the same brand of these specific foods, and this is because autistic people can be hypersensitive to small sensory differences, which may occur between one brand of crisp and the next. Other common eating behaviours displayed by autistic people and autistic women include a strong need for routine and familiarity around meal times. This may include them sitting in the same seat or using the same crockery and cutlery each time. Many autistic people also struggle to eat around others, especially those that they don't know, and a need for sameness can lead to someone eating the same foods on repeat or at the same times each day. Whilst each of these behaviours may also be a symptom of an eating disorder like anorexia nervosa, it's important to note that this does not mean that all autistic people who have these preferences are suffering from an eating disorder. Unlike atypical eating behaviours, which often bring comfort and even joy to autistic people, an eating disorder is a serious and potentially fatal mental illness. They have a significant impact on a person's mental and physical health, with anorexia being known as the most deadly mental illness due to its high mortality rates. In a similar way to self-harm, eating disorders are often a subconscious way for an autistic woman to manage emotions which feel overwhelming or difficult, as food becomes a coping mechanism and a way to numb painful feelings. ARFID is another type of eating disorder, and ARFID stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. It's a sensory-based eating disorder and one of the most common eating disorders seen in autistic individuals, with 44% of children who have ARFID also being autistic. ARFID sufferers have a highly restricted diet and the complete avoidance of either certain foods or whole food groups. And the avoidance may be driven by an individual's aversion to a food's sensory experience, For example, avoiding fruits due to their unpredictable taste and texture, which can cause extreme anxiety. But avoidance may also be driven by previous traumas relating to specific foods or food in general, such as a young child who choked on food or someone who had an allergic reaction to a contaminated meal. ARFID extends further than autistic individuals simply just having safe foods, as it leads to very low body weights, stunted growth, and physical health complications as a result of not being able to meet nutritional needs. And ARFID also has a severe impact on an individual's daily functioning, and it causes very high levels of anxiety. Unlike eating disorders such as anorexia, which we'll cover in a minute, ARFID doesn't involve a preoccupation with weight or shape, and body image concerns are not a reason for dietary restriction. There is a very well-known link between anorexia and autism, with 20 to 35% of adults with anorexia being autistic or having elevated autistic traits. And autistic people are diagnosed with anorexia at higher rates than non-autistic people. But very sadly, we often have worse outcomes when seeking treatment. Anorexia nervosa is also an eating disorder which causes significant restriction of a person's food intake. It may also involve the use of compensatory behaviours like over-exercising or laxative use, and it's driven by a strong preoccupation with weight and shape, distorted body image, and an overwhelming fear of weight gain. Anorexia is also frequently a subconscious response to trauma, though unlike ARFID, a person may restrict food intake and try to control their weight because this reduces the intensity of emotions temporarily. Autistic people, and autistic women in particular, are known to be 5 times more likely to develop anorexia than their neurotypical peers. This may partly be because autistic traits include many of the predispositions for someone developing anorexia. Autistic people are more likely to experience a broader range of stressful life experiences as traumatic. This may include transitions like moving house or moving schools, feeling left out by peers, and experiencing late or misdiagnosis. We are more likely to be bullied and are at higher risk of abuse, with 44% of autistic individuals experiencing victimization. Given that trauma is a common risk factor for developing anorexia, these experiences are likely to contribute to its increased prevalence in autistic women. Anorexia is most commonly developed in adolescence and teen years, and these are incredibly overwhelming and challenging times for any young person. However, for an autistic girl, this is often even more distressing. The emotional and physical changes associated with puberty and a desire to maintain the same body or even avoid maturation as a result of fearing change can feed into negative body image and psychological distress, which, combined with a need to feel in control, can lead to the development of eating disorders like anorexia. There are also many overlaps between the autistic experiences and those of someone with anorexia, which may explain the increased prevalence. These include repetitive and restrictive behaviours like autistic stimming, which in those with anorexia is displayed via their restricted diet and a desire to manage and control it, for example, through calorie counting. Social anxiety is also a key symptom of those with anorexia and, of course, a common autistic experience. Social anxiety may be a perpetuating factor of anorexia, as eating disorder behaviours may act to reduce symptoms of anxiety temporarily, as an individual's focus is instead shifted onto concerns about controlling weight and intake. Social anxiety has also been identified as an additional risk factor for eating disorder development, with individuals who fear negative evaluation from others being predicted to show an increased drive for thinness and restraint, which are key elements of anorectic thinking. Emotion regulation challenges and alexithymia are noted to be key symptoms of anorexia and are, of course, common autistic experiences. Those suffering from anorexia frequently describe their eating disorder behaviours as a way of controlling and regulating emotions which would otherwise feel out of control. As we know, many autistic women fly under the radar for years before being identified as autistic. This not only causes mental health challenges, but it can lead to the misdiagnosis and diagnostic overshadowing of conditions like eating disorders. Many girls and women who've previously been diagnosed with anorexia are now recognised as having ARFID, alongside being autistic. This is because the common features of both autism and anorexia can make it difficult to distinguish between anorexic behaviour or cognition and an autistic experience and behaviour. The repetitive and restrictive behaviours which an autistic woman may present with, for example, only eating their safe foods on repeat, could be viewed by professionals as a symptom of anorexia. This is because it's common for anorexia sufferers to have what are known as fear foods, foods that they will avoid due to high levels of anxiety or irrational fears around the consequences of eating them, which usually stem from concerns around their impact on weight or shape. An autistic person displaying an avoidance of specific foods is more likely to do so for sensory reasons, such as it having a distressing texture or taste. Alongside this, obsessions displayed by many individuals with anorexia, like calorie counting or an intense focus on health, can often be explained as an autistic hyperfixation or an intense interest, rather than being driven by fear and a need for control. They may not recognise or understand themselves why they do this, and hence the common conclusion reached is that a person is suffering and presenting with anorexia, especially when they also exhibit other key features like a low body weight and an obsession with exercise or nutrition. Cognitive inflexibility is also known to worsen, with mindsets and behaviours becoming increasingly rigid as a person's body is affected by starvation, meaning a malnourished autistic person who is either suffering from anorexia or ARFID is likely to display these behaviours in an intensified manner. Women who haven't been identified as autistic, and in fact many known autistic women too, presenting with low weights as a result of a restricted diet and showing rigidity and high anxiety levels around mealtimes are likely to receive a diagnosis of anorexia. These women may instead be suffering from ARFID, with presenting issues explained by sensory aversions and autistic traits, and they then face misdiagnosis, which can not only prevent us from accessing an autism assessment and diagnosis, but also increases the likelihood of eating disorder treatment being unsuccessful and in many cases actually traumatic. Autistic people who suffer from anorexia also experience anorexia in a different way, with it being driven more by sensory or interoceptive issues than body image and weight. And this can mean that even when a diagnosis of anorexia is correct, treatment tailored to the needs of neurotypical patients is not accessible or suitable for autistic people. With all this being said, there are also a lot of autistic individuals who also have anorexia, and this isn't explained by sensory issues with food or hyperfixation. Every person with anorexia or ARFID will have different experiences and symptoms, and the interaction between their neurodivergence and mental health will affect them to different extents. Having spoken about many of the challenges that autistic women face, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about my own experiences as an autistic woman with anorexia and mental health difficulties. Unlike ARFID or anorexia stemming from sensory issues, my experience with anorexia has been more similar to that of a neurotypical person. However, after 8 years in various mental health services, I've come to realise the impact that not knowing I'm autistic has had on both me and my treatment. I'm sure you've all heard about the various predisposing factors associated with someone developing a mental health problem. And over the years, I've been able to identify various different triggers for me becoming unwell with my mental health. Almost all of these triggers link back to the fact that I'm autistic in one way or another, whether that be the autistic experience of sensory overload or the way I've processed traumatic events differently to those around me because of my neurodivergence. Whilst I wouldn't say that I blame the fact that I developed mental health problems and anorexia on being autistic, in my case, it's most definitely contributed to and perpetuated many of my struggles. Around age 12, I started to get this intense feeling that I was not like my friends. I felt like a complete outsider in every friendship group I had. I was always the last to be invited or wanted and the first to be dropped or forgotten, and I had no idea why. I started to believe that I must be a really awful person to be so disliked, and I never felt good enough compared to those around me. whether that be my results in tests or how I looked. I really didn't understand why everyone was so obsessed with talking about boys or gossiping with each other at break times. And although I did my best to pretend that I was also interested and I was normal like them, this only really added to my fears that others wouldn't ever like me. I was always a very strong believer and follower of the rules. I needed everything to be fair and just. And so when I was unfairly dropped from a friendship group, it filled me with anger and confusion. I suffered from severe anxiety, which extended to a crippling fear of getting in trouble at school. I can remember so vividly the nightmares I used to have about being late or forgetting my maths book and then getting a detention because of this. And it kept me awake at night, worrying and obsessively checking my bag to ensure that there was nothing missing. The idea of being rejected by teachers, who were often the only people I felt may actually like me because I was a dedicated student, would often consume me. At the time, I had no idea that I was autistic. The social challenges and differences in communication between my peers and I felt like it was just an indicator that I was the weird kid. The isolation and anxiety I experienced because I'm autistic were emotions that I couldn't identify, let alone communicate and share. Autistic people experience differences in emotional processing, and for me, this meant that my reactions to traumatic or difficult events were not only different to how I and others expected, but it also took me much longer to process these emotions and feel them. My parents separated when I was around 6 years old, and there were many traumatic experiences relating to this throughout my childhood. However, my autistic brain didn't seem to process any of this until I was around 12, the same time that I went through the major transition from primary to secondary school, and around the same time we sadly lost my maternal grandmother. I felt so overwhelmed and out of control about how I was feeling, like I was going mad. Why was it that all of a sudden, 6 years after it happened, was I grieving over the separation of my parents? I had no idea how to manage these emotions on my own, but couldn't communicate with those around me due to fears of being told off or rejected. The only way I felt able to express this pain was through physically hurting myself and seeing the injury in front of me. At the time, I didn't know this was self-harm, and I convinced myself and others it was just accidental. My distress was very much internalized. It didn't feel possible or safe to share this with anyone else. Grieving the loss of my grandmother also highlighted the difference between me and the rest of my family. They all seemed to be able to rationalize the death and accept that she was no longer suffering, and this just made me feel angry and more alone. The transition to high school is really commonly identified as being one of the most challenging periods in time for autistic girls. We have to deal with a complete change in routine, a huge increase in social interactions and expectations, making a new group of friends, something that no one actually teaches you how to do, and it baffled me for so long how everyone else was doing it, and the idea of growing up. I came home from school exhausted every single day, in physical pain with a headache or a stomach ache because of the sensory overload of the school environment, and just completely overwhelmed. The idea of growing up petrified me. So much change, the unknown aspects of whether I'd get a job, be able to afford a house in a safe area, or put money into a pension. And these were really very real and scary worries that I had even when I was only 13. I couldn't control any of it. My body was changing and I felt extremely self-conscious and uncomfortable. Comments from others would always echo in my brain, and I kept coming back to it being another reason why no one really liked me. I'd very much flown under the radar in a small and friendly primary school that felt familiar and manageable. I'd been the perfect student, achieving constantly above my peers and labelled as gifted and talented. And I had no idea how challenging the transition to high school would be, or the extent to which I would struggle. And this is a very common occurrence for late diagnosed autistic girls. I grew up surrounded by various rules about food and exercise, and with a very strong knowledge about calories. And as I mentioned before, being autistic means I feel very strongly about rules and not breaking them. So when everything felt very uncontrollable in my life and I felt very alone, I developed my own rule book, which brought a sense of calm and relief to an otherwise chaotic life. Many of these rules stemmed from those that I'd overheard or been given as a child. When I noticed that as a result, my weight was decreasing and I could identify that feeling I got when I saw a lower number on the scale was one of achievement and finally feeling in control, this made me feel good. It hadn't been my initial intention to lose weight, but when my autistic brain made a link between following the rules, decreasing weight, and feeling good, it was a predictable pattern, one in which if I did X, I got Y, and this made me feel strong and like it was, something good in my life. Pattern recognition is both one of my greatest strengths and my biggest challenges. The chaos that I had felt and chaos that I now know was so unbearable because of my need for structure and familiarity and certainty was squashed by anorexia. The rule book that I developed brought me comfort. My world felt smaller because I was so intensely focused on food and weight and exercise, and therefore all the wider worries about fitting in with friends seemed to take up less space. A smaller world feels more manageable and more predictable, especially when malnutrition and starving yourself leads to a numbing of emotions and grief and traumas just seem to disappear. My emotional pain seemed to take a physical representation. My shrinking body felt like it was pain I could see, but it also made me less visible to others at school. And this is something I now know is actually an extension of me trying to mask and camouflage in with my friends. To begin with, my autistic brain thrived from the strict routines, and my overwhelm decreased, and my anxiety about the future began to slip away. But it wasn't long before the impact of this started to become extremely distressing and hard to consider changing. I'd like to say that while some aspects of the treatment that I've received over the years have been holistic and individualized, there are many more aspects of my care that have actually been really difficult and traumatic. But I was never quite able to explain this to those working with me, especially because I had no idea of the accommodations I needed or how to meet my needs. So this only really perpetuated the narrative that I was a defiant and awkward patient. One of the most common questions you're asked in mental health services is, how do you feel? A question that I hate now, even 8 years later. I have no idea how to respond to this, so I just answer, I'm okay, no matter what's going on. My inability to process or communicate or understand why I was clinging to an eating disorder filled both me and the professionals working with me with frustration and hopelessness. In my first year alone, I was expected to work with over 10 different professionals. And as someone who struggles immensely to build therapeutic relationships and with sensitivity to loss, I just completely struggled with this. I was transferred to a whole new team in a new building and a new area just 6 months after starting with one. I needed structure and familiarity, and when we requested I was given a therapist who could see me each week and maintain a routine, I was labelled as difficult and demanding for stating my needs. As I mentioned earlier, it took 8 years under mental health services for someone to suggest that I may be autistic. In these 8 years, I collected an array of diagnoses with everything from social anxiety to BPD to rejection sensitivity caused by avoidant personality disorder. I've faced additional traumas as a result of being misdiagnosed, dismissed, and made to feel as though I'm manipulative and untreatable when, in fact, I'm just autistic. Eventually, I found a nurse who gave me hope for my future. Someone who makes no judgments and supports me to recognise not only the challenges of being autistic, but also the strengths and unique insights it offers me. The difference that being listened to, met by professionals where I'm at, offered flexible appointments and the ability to work with a smaller but more consistent care team has given me hope that one day, with their support, I will be fully recovered. Even small things like a waiting room that's quiet rather than overstimulating or clinical, being encouraged to manage emotion regulation in my sessions however I need to, whether that be a trusty stress ball or bringing my little sausage dog with me, and feeling supported to communicate however I feel able to, is ensuring I'm able to fully engage in treatment. Choosing to recover from anorexia means choosing to step into the unknown over remaining in the safety and familiarity of living with it. It means losing the predictability of what life looks like, however isolated and miserable that may be, and the routine I've maintained and felt safe with for years. It means experiencing all those terrifying fears of an uncertain future that I couldn't cope with when I was 13, rather than numbing them through restriction. It comes with increased emotion and sensitivity as your mind begins to recover from a lack of nutrition, and the focus of your days moves away from revolving around food and nutrition and weight. My physical appearance has changed, as has the way my body feels, and even the sensory experience of wearing certain clothes or simply existing in my body. It also means that I'll have to process traumas, not only that I've hidden from being a child, but also that I've acquired whilst being unwell. Recovery, to put it quite lightly, is an autistic person's idea of a nightmare. It involves changing, experiencing emotions which you feel like you can't survive, and changes that your eating disorder brain tries to convince you will be the end of you. Recovery is likely to take longer and require more work for those of us who are autistic, but that doesn't mean that it isn't possible or that we don't deserve ongoing support for however long it takes to get there. With the support of patient and caring clinicians, I've made progress which I never thought would be possible. Each individual will have their own unique story and will experience an eating disorder or mental health problems in a way which only they can describe. But I hope that hearing my story has given you a little bit of an insight into the challenges that autistic women face, why recovery may take a little bit longer, and how best you can support someone through it.
Thank you, Molly and Kay. That was an amazing presentation, and I think it's given people lots and lots to think about. We'll collect all the questions up and try and answer at the end. I can already see there are some quite technical questions in the Q&A, so we'll try and fill those out to Kay and Molly, who may be able to come back with some answers that will help progress on that one. We're now going to flip the coin slightly, because we're now going to look at an emerging clinical model around working with autistic people who may have disorderly eating or disordered eating or anorexia, but who fit into a variety of groups. We're going to have a look at a model that's been an emerging model that seems to be picking up many of the issues that have been identified in the first presentation. So let me introduce Emily and Lorna.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I'm Lorna McGuigan and I'm here with my colleague Emily today, and we are going to talk to you about our service, which is CAMHS Hospital at Home, and it's a service that has been set up for young people with eating disorders. Could you go to the next slide, please, and perhaps skip forward past this one too, thank you. So just to give a bit of background information about why our service was developed. So eating disorder referrals for inpatient services really increased, particularly sort of during the pandemic. And as you can see, numbers really went up year on year. So our service was developed in September 21. And not only were referrals increasing, but we also had a loss of beds within the network as well. So some inpatient beds closed, some of the sort of private hospital beds. So we were getting an increase in referrals, and there were actually less inpatient beds for young people. Also, there's the recognition that admission to hospital does present in itself some risks for young people and their ability to engage with treatment. So whilst our service Hospital at Home isn't primarily set up for young people with autism, it is for young people with eating disorders. We do have high numbers of young people coming into us with a diagnosis of autism, or potentially they might receive a diagnosis when they're with us. But there was a recognition that children and young people with autistic traits had a greater use of intensive treatments alongside those difficulties sort of both prior and post-treatment. There was also the reality that day patient services may disadvantage those living further away. When some of the hospital beds did close, it meant young people had to travel further from home. So if they did require inpatient admissions, it would quite often be quite a distance from home, which would impact on engagement with family and also discharge planning. And there was also a gap between the intensity of the input offered. So obviously inpatient treatment is really intensive. It's 7 days a week, and community services are very stretched in themselves, and often, you know, you might get an hour or two appointment each week. So there was a real gap in services. So Hospital at Home, we were designed to primarily, our aim was to prevent hospital admissions where we could, but also to think about those young people that might have been in hospital for a long period of time, and it was proving difficult to have a package in place to help support discharge them home. So we thought, could we enable shorter admissions and do that step down from hospital? So there's an acknowledgement that many inpatient wards aren't designed to meet the needs of young people with autism. NICE agrees, inpatient environments are typically quite bright, noisy, they can be very overwhelming. Both Emily and I have a background of working on the inpatient wards, so we're very aware of the need for young people to go into hospital and be in that safe environment and receive the treatment, but actually just the environmental challenges that they present can be really significant. Also, the acknowledgement that sometimes by bringing young people into a new environment, it can actually increase distress, exposure to the ward milieu and to other young people with similar difficulties, or even being exposed to certain challenges that young people had never witnessed or experienced before. That would be one of the risks of really bringing young people into hospital. So that risk of iatrogenic harm, acknowledgement that the environment can contribute to that sensory overstimulation. There we go. Thank you, Emily. Which can lead to autistic burnout or some incidents. So young people might come into hospital and response to some of that would be actually the wards are always set up to be least restrictive, but actually then in terms of wanting to prevent self-harm, unfortunately sometimes it would lead to incidents of violence and aggression on the ward, which can be really traumatizing for all that are involved. So thinking about, we've got some figures here of referrals for young people, and you can see that there was that real increase, really recognising the challenges like I've just described of young people going into hospital, and thinking about our response to that really.
So just to say, they're just the people that had an actual diagnosis of autism that were referred to a Tier 4 unit for people with eating disorders specifically. So there's been quite a huge increase.
Absolutely, it's pretty much almost doubled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just to give you a bit of an overview about our service and who we are. So we cover a really large geographical area. So we cover Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, Gloucester, and then we call it BSW, but that's Baines, Swindon and Wiltshire. So we support young people with eating disorders who would be referred for an inpatient bed. So basically we have something called the Thames Valley Single Point of Access. We refer to it as the SPA, and any young person that requires inpatient admission, that referral gets sent into the SPA. If it's a young person with an eating disorder, we will then look at that referral. And the way that the Thames Valley Provider Collaborative is set up is they have a weekly CAP call. So all referrals in for a young person that needs a bed are discussed. And then we will look at whether that young person with an eating disorder, whether we think that we may be able to support them to stay out of hospital. So we are an intensive service. We are a fully remote service. So from start to finish, our service is remote. So everything is via Microsoft Teams. And we operate Monday to Friday between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m, which means we have to really think carefully about those young people with quite high risks and who would be appropriate for us to support within our service. But what we will aim to do is really think about contingency planning and crisis planning with young people out of hours. So each of our young people will have a safety plan of what to do in the hours that we're not operating. So a bit of a timeline. So we were a pilot initiative. So we started off very slowly. We were a very small team initially with lots of us working part-time. And yet that was back in September 2021. So we built up to a caseload of 6 young people. Within 12 months, things were going well. We got permanent funding agreed, and then we also moved towards expansion. So we're basically up to the point now where we can take on up to 12 young people. There is a little bit of flexibility around that. And we've grown from the early days of a team of about 6, and we're up to about 17 of us now as the staff team. Just a little bit of an overview of our team. So we're very well resourced. We have a family therapist joining us in July, and then that will be our team fully recruited. We have consultant psychiatrists, we have art therapist, dietitian, psychologist, and then we have the nursing team. I would say that we are similarly resourced in terms of our staff into what the inpatient wards would be. And yeah, like I said, we have, so initially we did have some challenges with the recruitment process, but actually I think when we moved from being sort of fixed term posts and got the permanent funding, that seemed to help in terms of recruiting into the team. So to give you a bit of overview of the treatment that we can offer for young people. So when young people are referred, we offer an assessment. So we'll do that initial assessment. Again, that is offered remotely. So we invite the young person and their family into that, and usually 2 members of the team will join. We aim to respond to referrals quite quickly, because obviously when the referral comes in, the young person's at crisis point and requiring inpatient admission. So ideally, we want to get an assessment booked in as soon as possible. So we'll try and book it in the following week. And we have a couple of assessment slots, and we have a weekly referrals meeting as a team. So once we have completed the assessment and once we've agreed treatment, we'll do a care planning session with the young person, and we aim to be really flexible and really patient-centred around what we can offer. But these are some of the things that we do. So we'll do one-to-one sessions, so daily one-to-one sessions with young people. In the early stages of treatment, we might just start very slowly and do things called getting to know you sessions. So we might just put in very short calls, so sort of 15-minute calls to say hello, share a bit of information about ourselves, and start getting the young person familiar with the team and what we do, and start to get to know them before we move into sort of full treatment. We offer parent sessions, so we work just as closely with our parents as we do our young people, and it's really important to have that space with parents. We also have groups, so we have parent group each week. And then MDT sessions, so like I said, we've got psychology, art therapist, dietitian, so we'll set up sessions with members of the team. We do meal supports, so we will offer meal supports normally up to about 3 times a day. Not all young people require meal supports, but some do, so that is something that we offer. And then we have an agreement with our community teams that they will continue to see the young person weekly, so they will monitor their weight, their physical observations, and they'll continue with those weekly appointments. And I think one of the strengths of our service is that we like to give the message to the young person and the family that we're always available between them hours of 8 AM, 8 PM. So they might have their set appointments, but if they need something in the interim, they can email the team inbox and we'll set up an ad hoc call. So there's normally some capacity within the way we work that if someone is in distress and needs that extra support, then we can be present and responsive. So some of the adaptations that we have made, so we try, I think we have an advantage in some ways over the inpatient environments in that we can be, we can give a lot of notice about things, we can be very structured, we can send information out in advance. So we will try, and so each week our appointments are sent out every Friday for the following week, and with their appointments the young person will know which member of the team they're meeting, but that generally stays the same each week through their treatment, with sometimes the addition of say art therapy, or sometimes we'll start reducing appointments. We are able to be quite consistent. We will ask young people their preferences in terms of being on camera, backgrounds. We do recognise a lot of young people when they first start with us say they don't like online support and they don't like being on screen. But actually I think because we are so frequent in how often we're meeting with young people, usually quite quickly they will get used to the remote sessions. If it's helpful, we will reduce the amount of staff that are working with young people, so we'll go down to minimum numbers if that feels helpful. I mentioned a bit earlier the getting to know you sessions. We'll also be flexible about how long them sessions can be. So if a young person would rather just have a 15-20 minute session because that's how long they can concentrate and focus for, that's absolutely fine. And on the other side of that, if they want a longer session, if they want an hour, that's absolutely fine. Sometimes we'll build up to young people being on camera if they're not comfortable to be on camera initially. We have had young people in the past that just chat to us using the chat function, and then we'll build up to them being on screen. We do something called creating the ideal eating environment with our young people. And we also think about if we're making any changes, we recognise the importance of processing time. So we'll quite often ask young people and parents what their thoughts are about changes to the meal plan. Then we'll discuss it as a team, and then we'll go back to parents and young person and agree a date that they're going to make those changes. So nothing is sprung on people. We'll adapt meal plans based on individual needs, and also utilise the peace pathway resources. And we really try and get to know our young people really well and their families, and really respect sort of individual differences, and think about their communication passport and how we incorporate all those preferences into their care planning.
So just a little bit of data from the patients that we've had so far. So at the point of creation of this PowerPoint, we'd had 45 discharges. And for those people that had completed full treatment, they haven't had any re-referrals to a Tier 4 service. So 31 have completed treatment. 8 young people self-discharged prior to completing the treatment. And then 7 people needed to go to the CAMS inpatient or day treatment program. So I missed off the number on. So I kind of just broke that data down for you a little bit. So I put that into people that have had a confirmed autism diagnosis, people that had a query autism diagnosis, and those people that did not have an autism diagnosis. So we had 11 patients with a confirmed autism diagnosis, and 7 were discharged home and 4 were discharged to a hospital service. For query autism, we had 6 young people discharged home and 1 young person discharged to hospital. And for no autism, we had 27 young people discharged home and 1 person discharged to hospital. So there's quite a high correlation of those people that have autism and those people that don't, and who needs to go to an inpatient service, which I kind of feel like was reflected earlier in the kind of people with autism having a worse treatment outcome sometimes. And I did the same with weights. So I think I would like to do a little bit more data at some point, but kind of we're just in the early stages of putting data out. We've been around for just over 2 years. And so this is kind of people's average weight per height percentage change. And so again, I broke it into confirmed autism diagnosis, query, and no autism diagnosis. And so as you can see, the people who had a query autism diagnosis seemed to lose a lot of weight prior to their discharge to hospital, whereas those with confirmed autism didn't. So I think what I found roughly from some of the data is that people with confirmed autism were presenting with a much lower weight than those with kind of query or no autism, and that was hence the data differences. But overall, kind of people with a confirmed autism diagnosis were doing just as well in terms of the weight gain. And then this is the outcome measures. So my assistant psychologist just asked me to say that if you needed to go to an inpatient unit, we didn't do a discharge measure, often because of how quickly they needed to go to an inpatient. There wasn't always time. But we do a what's called an EDEQ, which is an eating disorder examination questionnaire, which is kind of used quite broadly across eating disorder services. It's looking at a lot of different measures and kind of looking at the severity of your symptoms. So the light blue, is confirmed autism diagnosis, purple is query, and dark blue is none. And actually, you can see that there's a larger reduction in their eating disorder scores, which is positive, by the way. So you typically present with quite a high score with an eating disorder, and then as you get better, your score gets lower. And so actually, people who had a confirmed autism diagnosis appeared to actually have a larger reduction in their symptoms by the end of our treatment with us. So a couple of preconceptions that people might give us kind of prior to coming on board with us, whether or not that's other professionals or parents or patients, is that people with autism won't be able to engage. So that's often something that we get. They can't have a referral to our service because they're autistic. The virtual meal supports won't work. Their therapeutic relationship won't be able to develop. The risks are too high, and that young people with autism do not like virtual sessions. And then this is some of the feedback that we get that I would say kind of challenges some of that. So I do think that the hospital at home helped us get in a good place to carry on treatment in the community by looking at different ways to tackle fear foods how to cope with anxiety and distress around eating, and certainly in public. I think the team as a whole, they had to think about a lot of things in a slightly different ways. So we got a wide range of help from lots of different perspectives. Hospital at Home offered a buffering transition between admission to a unit and community care. And some of the parent sessions really helped me to support my daughter emotionally with weight restoration. So we've kind of done lots of training in the last 2 years, kind of around autism. So one of our staff, which was me, so I went and did the autism, working with autistic families and patients, master's module. The whole team have done a 2-day training with the NDTI team. We go to the Peace Pathway webinars, and if we're not able to attend, then we have access to watch them afterwards. We've done some RFID training. I think about 80% of the team has done the CYP IAPT training. Around half our team have gone and done the family treatment for anorexia nervosa. And we've also, some of our staff have been on the sensory workshop training. So we're kind of just in the process now of putting all that training together and thinking about the future. So then things that we're going to be thinking about over the next year or two is we'd like to have a pathway for kind of atypical anorexia and or ARFID. We want to set up a physical health clinic so that we're making sure that we're addressing some of those needs and kind of thinking about where we can be giving out some education. We'll be looking at quality improvements, so we're going to be taking all of our stats and data and thinking about how we can improve those further. Thinking about different questionnaires. So something that was kind of been identified in some of our training is that autistic people struggle with some of the questions. They're quite ambiguous at times, they're quite great questions. So we'll be thinking about if there's any different questionnaires we can be using, and just further education across the rest of the trust. We're hoping to kind of put on some training for people to take what we've learned and pass it on. I believe that's the end of our presentation.
And I think I just also wanted to mention that so we're part of the provider collaborative who commissioned our service, and they also have commissioned so stepped care. So that's a similar service to what we offer for adults. And then there's also the LDA hospital at home, which is for young people with learning disability and autism. And that's quite a different model to our model, in that their plan and their goal is to actually go into young people at home and support at home. So there's lots of work going on within the PC around innovative services for young people. But yeah, that's the end of our presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily and Lorna. That was really interesting and insightful. And I think it's quite interesting listening to the two presentations together. We've got quite a few questions, but actually I'd be really interested, and I think other people would be interested, to just hear, if you don't mind, Molly, just to hear a little bit from you, because you gave us a very good insight into your experience of being on a treatment pathway. What would have you got any immediate views or insights on the one that you've just heard about?
Yeah, so I would say that personally, I struggle a lot with online, so I am a lot better in person. And I'm not sure whether that's just me or whether that's a representation of many autistic females. But in terms of like the intensity, I definitely think that, especially for an autistic person, it takes us a lot longer to build those trusting relationships. And so if you're only seeing someone once a week, actually it can take a very long time to build that relationship. And the time in which I built the strongest relationships with my care teams were when either I was in hospital and I was seeing them every day, and they got to know me and they got to know my presentation and what that kind of meant in terms of how I was feeling and what I needed. Or when I was, I guess, having a very similar treatment to the hospital at home, and I was having my daily meal support sessions, therapy sessions on a daily basis with the same person. That was when my relationship really built up, and that was when my recovery was sort of most supported. I think another autistic struggle is that if I am feeling an emotion, I find it very hard to hold on to that emotion for, like, say, another week and then share it then. It's going to be very hard for me to understand that and communicate that at the best times. So actually, if I'm having that daily contact, I'm more likely to be able to share that sooner rather than later. Hopefully that makes sense, but I would definitely say that for autistic patients, for me anyway, the more frequent I can have my appointments, the better, especially at the beginning when that relationship building is taking place.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I suppose what this is all about is that autistic or not, everybody's different and there'll be different ways of working, which I think is emerging in the work that's coming through that Emily and Lorna are taking forward. But I thought you might want to have a comment there on that one. Right, we've got loads of questions, and some of them are quite similar. So I'm going to gather together because there's quite a lot about how do you support people pre-diagnosis. So if people are waiting for a diagnosis but are clearly in need of support, what would we suggest the best approaches are? I'm going to start with Kay and Molly, and then I'm going to talk to Emily and Lorna because I think that they already do work in that area anyway. But Molly and Kay, what are your thoughts about that sort of that pre-diagnostic world?
Molly, do you want me to speak first? Yeah. Well, again, for me, my lived experience and working with young people, it would be reducing as much demands and reducing the sensory input in the while someone's waiting for therapeutic intervention. The more we can build capacity and build the window of tolerance via other methods, so demand reduction, increase in special interests, exploration of stimming, yes, okay, they may be reliant on safe foods but allowing that and not putting any demands on until there's a therapeutic relationship built, that would be my go-to response initially.
Really helpful. Molly, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think the period in which someone is waiting for an autism assessment and the period in which they're actually being assessed for autism, because I know in my case it was kind of a series of appointments, so that took place over, say, a time period of about a month. That can actually be a really difficult period for someone who's autistic, and the period straight after, because for me personally, whilst there was a bit of a relief that, okay, I now know I'm autistic, I can now move forward from this, I definitely also experienced a range of other emotions. I was grieving almost over the fact that I'd been diagnosed as autistic, because I kind of realized a lot of the struggles that I had thought were symptoms of a mental illness and therefore I thought would get better were actually autistic traits that were going to be with me for the rest of my life. And so what I really needed in that period before diagnosis, during and just after, was space and time to explore what being autistic meant to me, how that changed what I already knew about myself and what I already knew about my eating disorder treatment. And it not being, just having that space and feeling supported to be able to grieve about that, and not feeling judged for grieving over that, and just having it accepted that I'm going to have all of these emotions about this diagnosis, and just being in a really autism affirming environment, because that's a really tricky time for both the person and the family as well. The young person or the adult is not only facing their own sort of feelings about being diagnosed autistic, but they've also got the reactions of family and of friends, and just really feeling supported in sharing that and working through that is crucial, I think.
That's great. That's really helpful, and that's really interesting insight into that period of whilst you're waiting for your diagnosis, and then the immediate sort of period afterwards, and what that means. So, Laura and Emily, talk us through a little bit about people who are waiting for a diagnosis or have been referred across. Can you tell us a little bit about what your is there?
So something that we actually found quite hard when we were doing our presentation was thinking about the adaptations that we make, because it isn't like, oh, this person's autistic, so here's the adaptations we're going to do. We just treat everybody the same in terms of we meet their needs. So we don't really see them as adjustments we're making to care. We see it as, this is an individual, this is the needs that they have, and therefore we're going to provide the best treatment that we can for them, and meet those individual needs. And so, yeah, so we something that we do quite a lot is if there is a query with autism, we do try and get them assessed in our service if they're open to that, because our kind of length of time to do that is a lot shorter, because we're being seen so much more frequently than kind of waiting on the list outside of our service. But yeah, we meet people's needs, and we think about what the goal is. So if we've got someone that's a very, very low weight and actually is terrified about moving and trying a kind of higher variety of food, that's not the ultimate goal at that point. The ultimate goal initially is to get people weight restoring. So if they're having the same 5 food groups over and over again, and we're undecided whether or not this person has autism, whether or not it's a sensory difficulty, whether or not it is a eating disorder behaviour, at that point, the key thing is let's help this person to weight restore. And once they're kind of out of starvation mode, it's going to be easier regardless for them to make changes. So I don't care that you're eating the same 5 foods. Let's build that up. And then we can kind of make those smaller changes and challenge the eating disorder kind of further down the line once we've got a bit of a clearer picture.
Yeah, and I think there's always that dilemma as well in terms of quite often clinicians are thinking about when is the right time for autism assessment to take place. So if you have got a young person who's very starved and very underweight, then that will have an impact on potentially have an impact on their ability to be able to tolerate that assessment or to benefit from that assessment. So we have to think really carefully about when the right time is. But what I would say is that it wouldn't necessarily impact on their treatment with us if they're waiting for a diagnosis, because we would still be working with them on their presenting difficulties at the time.
You don't need to wait for a diagnosis to actually reflect that person needs the light dimmed slightly, or wants your background,
so that's part of doing our sort of ideal eating environment, which we would do for every young person.
Do you want to say what the creating ideal environment? Do you want me to say what the creating?
Yeah.
So the creating the ideal eating environment, if anyone hasn't seen it, is a peace pathway document that is used to kind of think about. It's basically like a sensory screen. So it's kind of got the 8 senses on there, and it's specifically looking around food, but often when we're doing it, we'll tailor it around just general life as well. So I'll do the section on eating, but then I'll also think about their general life, and then we'll think about how we can tailor that to what we're doing. So actually, if you're saying I find it really, really difficult when one day, Emily, you're in the office and the next day you're at home, that's really hard for me. Okay, that's fine. Should I put a blur background on then, or should I put a clear white background on? We made some changes a while ago after speaking to the peace team, didn't we, about the camera settings that we had to try and reduce the amount of flickering that young people were seeing on the screen, to see if that had an effect. So yes, we kind of try and take as much of the sensory changes that we can make. We've kind of got lots of different options, but because people are different, it's not a one size fits all response.
That's great. So it's a really interesting response. So it's about being needs led and not waiting for a diagnosis to respond to those needs, which is something that's becoming more frequent in the conversations we hear, but we still hear about people being turned away from pathways because they're autistic or because they're waiting for a diagnosis. So it's quite good to hear that you don't, and that's nice. We talked about peace pathway a lot today. There are some resources available online. So after the event, we'll send you through to the link to the peace work, and then people can have a look on that and see their way forward. We've got some interesting questions really about parents and therapeutic input into with parents and working with family therapy, and often a really important element of this work. You touched on it in your presentation. Do you want to talk through it a little bit more around what that often looks like, and how you build it with parents and families often who've had quite a tricky journey to get to you? So there's a lot in that work, isn't there?
Absolutely, and we'll have some parents that absolutely will want to do anything at all possible to keep their young people at home, and they are very welcoming of the service that we're offering. And then you might get other parents who are exhausted. They feel like their young person hasn't been well for a long time, and it's that they feel like hospital is the only choice, and therefore they aren't as sort of welcoming of our service. And I think our approach to assessment, to care planning, to trying to engage parents is really, really important. And actually actually I think we find that we are spending as much time with the families and the parents as we are the young people. And you may have heard we touched upon the FTAN approach, which is an approach used to motivate parents to support their young person with their eating difficulties. But we're never a team that is like one size fits all. So if actually parents are saying to us, we've been doing this approach for the last 12 months, nothing has changed, we'll really think carefully with them about what might be useful. But we get to know the families really well. And yeah, I think when parents are able to sort of value what we are offering and really engage. We do things like we ask parents for feedback each week that goes into our ward round. The more input we can get from young people and their parents and their families, the more helpful and useful that is for us to think about treatment and sort of plans for the week. So we have a lot of contact with parents, which I think is really useful.
Yeah, so like we do like parent sessions, which is like actually like more of a formal piece of work. So that might be kind of like psychoeducation, or it might just be kind of a bit of I've had parents turn up with a glass of wine and just do a bit of a debrief with me, just to kind of need to be like, it's been an awful week and can I just blurt out everything that's going on. But then we do parent group, which is like it's all, you know, all the parents are invited that can kind of come along, and sometimes it is we're very needs led within that. So we often will have a piece of psychoeducation to do, but sometimes it will just be lots of the parents talking and supporting each other because they're all at different stages of treatment. When we're there for the meal supports, the parents are there supporting their child, and we're there to support the parent as much as the child. And sometimes we'll also do walk around feedback once a week. So we're also almost seeing the parents every day. And sometimes I have done calls with people where it is like we meet every day for 15 minutes and have a bit of a debrief on that day, if they need that as well. And I think that's one of the benefits of our service compared to an inpatient unit, because the inpatient units are so busy, they don't have the time to do the parent sessions in the way that we do. And obviously, because we're virtual in their house, that is a lot more increase than when you're having to kind of catch parents quickly at the end of their visit. I think I see parents more now than I ever did in inpatients, which they're a big part of the solution. So it's really important to really include them as much as possible.
Really interesting insight there, isn't it, into being able to spend more time with parents, not being ward-based service. So that's all really interesting. Right, we've got a couple of questions about the nature of your team, but then we've got a big question here that we've got for Kay and Molly. So this is a question about personality disorders and misdiagnosis. And this particular question talks about emotional and personality disorders potentially being a misdiagnosis of autistic women because it doesn't recognise because of the many routes that autistic women may enter the mental health system that Molly picked up. So, Kay and Molly, do you want to talk through some of that and how that fits together? Because I know it's a really, really live issue, and it would be helpful for people to sort of understand how that all seems to fit, is starting to fit together a little bit around some of the evidence and insights from autistic people.
Go on, Molly.
I guess my experience probably answers the question more than anything I can say, which is that I was diagnosed with EUPD, misdiagnosed with EUPD, 2 years before I got that off my diagnosis list, and then was diagnosed autistic. So yes, this isn't a clinical opinion, but so please no one quote me on this, but I really do have a very strong view that many females diagnosed with EUPD are probably autistic and don't have EUPD, because I think there's a massive issue around how EUPD and BPD is diagnosed, and how often you're not even properly assessed, you're just told you've got it, which was my case, and that's a very separate issue. But there is a huge overlap between BPD, EUPD, the same thing, and autism and the emotional regulation. And I think one of the hardest things for me to contest, I guess, was the symptom of BPD, EUPD, which is that you try to avoid, I can't remember exactly how it's worded now, but you fear abandonment, And because that I don't think is one of the as recognised autistic experiences of rejection sensitivity, that was one of the sticking points, I think, for me disputing my EUPD diagnosis, because there was this pattern of me being very fearful of being left and being very socially anxious and fearing what they said as abandonment, which is actually autistic rejection sensitivity. So I personally think that any female who's been diagnosed with EUPD should automatically be assessed for autism, because I know it's not just me. I have many friends who have also been diagnosed with EUPD and then since got an autism diagnosis. And I don't think it's just EUPD either, because the next diagnosis they tried to give me was avoidant personality disorder, which a psychologist actually told me, you either have avoidant personality disorder or you're autistic. So there are so many overlaps. And I think it's currently easier to be diagnosed with EUPD, far easier than it is to access an autism assessment and diagnosis. So yeah, I'm sure Kay has got very similar thoughts too.
In my career as a teacher, but also with my own children, I was like, you're not going near them with those diagnoses. They're waiting for a autism assessment. And then my own lived experience, obviously I'm older than Molly, but I've had diagnosis taken off my records once I got my autism assessment, and I mean, the amount of medication I've taken, I don't take any medication now. I'm autistic. I just manage my sensory and environment, my social processing. So and a lot of it hinges on that nervous system dysregulation. And then they put these psychiatric assessment and diagnosis on it, where actually it's the sensory and social processing difference causes dysregulation, emotional and physical and movement dysregulation that is part of being autistic. So yeah, I echo what Molly said.
So really interesting for people attending the session. It's an emerging evidence base now, and I'm not going to call it one way or the other, but I think it's a space that needs to be explored slightly more. And I think if you're currently working with people who are inpatients who have multiple diagnoses, it's always worth thinking about the conversations you want to ask the clinical teams around which diagnosis is and when, in order to help you make sure you get the sort of support right. Okay then, so Emily and Lorna, we have some questions around your team. So someone's asked a really good point around an OT and how occupational therapists, and whether you've got any occupational therapy input into the team and how that works.
So we put out a position for an occupational therapist when we first set up the service, and we had no applications for it. So then after a few months of that post not being filled, we actually put out the art therapy post. So we don't have occupational therapists within our team, but we do have an art therapist who has actually completed the sensory training recently. So no, we don't have occupational therapy input.
Super interesting, although actually an area that's really hard to recruit. So recognise that as well. The other one is about autistic people working in your service. Do you have any autistic people working in your service?
I'm trying to think.
No, we
don't have any.
No, I don't believe that we do.
So we do come across autistic professionals who are working in services as well. So it's sort of one of those things that's an emerging area. And so for people who are attending today, we'll share some resources on how that works and how some providers have further developed that bit of their work for. And I think we've already answered the question about, are you 100% remote? Because you are remote, but you have local visits that are done by the team that do the sort of physical check. Is that right?
Yeah, they continue to see their community team weekly for weights and physical obs.
Yeah. So the final set of questions, we've only got a few more minutes, and I hope the final set of questions are really about safe foods and working to extend what are seen as safe foods, but also what are the things that are most commonly seen as unsafe foods. Do you want to start off, Lorna and Emily, and then we'll move across to Molly and Kay?
Yeah, it's really difficult because where we are seeing young people with autism and eating disorders at times, it can be very, very varied. So people with an eating disorder might be avoidant of kind of high sugar, high fat, highly processed foods, whereas obviously young people have a diagnosis of autism or kind of more sensory sensitivities often kind of don't fit that presentation. So we might see much more highly predictable foods or bland foods, or what you might refer to as beige foods, which don't necessarily fit what a lot of people with eating disorders might have. So it can be really quite varied, depending on what is stronger in their mind, really. I'm trying to just think. I don't think we put anything that everyone doesn't like.
No, I think it is varied to each individual, really. But we will try and do as part of the assessment, we'll try and have an understanding of what food has been cut out since either the start of the eating disorder, or what has been, something that has been a dislike or a way of eating that, prior to the restricted eating. So that's our sort of base point, is what is due to the restricted eating, and then reintroduce things. And build up to that, but also reintroduce eating with other people, eating in social spaces. So by the end of treatment, it's really lovely, actually. We'll quite often have young people sending pictures in of they've managed to go out with friends. They've gone to Costa, they've gone for a pizza, they're having an ice cream on the beach. So all them things that you would do as part of social activity, which they hadn't done for a long time. That is our goal, is to support young people to get back to doing what they would normally have been doing before they'd started restricting their eating.
The only thing I can actually think of is compound foods. So what I mean by that is like something like a lasagna. So often you get that tends to be across both, is having things like a plain chicken breast here, a plain boiled potato here, and a plain set of vegetable here, so that we're not mixing our foods and we're not mixing our textures. That seems to be something that is deemed a fair food by both groups. I think that's the only thing I can think of.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And some interesting insights there. Molly and Kay, the bit about safe food, unsafe food, extending palettes. What are your thoughts?
I would say it's obviously going to depend on whether it's a person with ARFID or a person with anorexia. It's going to be quite a different approach. And also when it's someone who has anorexia and is autistic, it's going to depend on whether their safe foods are based on sensory profiles or whether they're based more around fears around weight and shape. In terms of the language that you should use, I know many people with anorexia do choose to use the term fair foods, and that's quite widely accepted. I'm not familiar with what the most widely accepted thing is to use in terms of ARFID, because again, I think it depends on the individual, and I think it's probably not fair food. It's probably more down the lines of unfamiliar food or unsafe food, rather than fair food. But I think in both cases, it's got to be a very slow and gradual process of introducing new foods. So whether someone fears it because of the texture or because of the sensory experience, or whether it's a fear driven by concerns around weight and shape, as autistic people, we need processing time. We need time to get it into our heads that this is what we're going to do. We're going to challenge this food. We're going to change this food. For me in particular, having it written down, so say my nurse writing down in front of me, right, this week you are going to challenge this. You are going to have an apple on Friday. Then it's kind of taking the choice away from me, and it's removing some of the executive functioning and the decision making, that it's written down in front of me. It's a plan, it's part of my routine, and that is what I'm going to do. But again, it's very different for every person.
My lived experience with food, so I go on how my body can actually process it. So some foods, I'll like almost gag because of the texture. And that's a hypersensory experience, but also because I can track exactly and feel where food is digestive wise. And I have acute, like, I can, in terms of digestive discomfort, not because there's anything wrong with my body, but because of how I process and how my intestine will react. So I choose foods on the energy it gives me, but also on how my body processes it, and if I have a gag reflex. So maybe that could be pathologized, but it for me, it's just sensory that it feels good, sensorily wise.
So I think that's a really nice ending note for the session, because I think one of the nice things about this session has been thinking about working with individuals and thinking about individual needs, and thinking that there are some things that are definitely not good to do, but there are other things that you would need to discuss and negotiate and explore with individuals to get to the right place. So really, really helpful. Thank you so much to the four of you for your brilliant presentations. We will send presentations out to everybody who is here. We'll send some links out to some information I've talked about today. And once again, thank you all very much. Take care. Bye.